Hi everyone, and welcome back to the channel. Today we have a very special guest, my father, Dr. Stephen Atkinson, wildlife biologist and veterinarian. So thanks for coming, and we're going to have a bit of a chat today all about polar bears to celebrate International Polar Bear Day. So let's start with just tell us a little bit about yourself and your career as a wildlife biologist.
Right, yes. Okay, thanks, Amelia. I'm originally from London, England, and studied biology as an undergraduate student in the University in England, and eventually came over to Canada to do my PhD on wild polar bears. After I finished that, I went to work for the government of the Northwest Territories as a polar bear biologist, and continued on from there conducting polar bear monitoring and research activities. Basically also eventually went back to school, became a veterinarian, and since then have kind of tried to do both things at the same time. I've studied polar bears for about 35 years now, over most of the Canadian Arctic into Alaska, parts of Greenland, and it's been a wild time. Yeah.
Wonderful. So yeah, you definitely had a lot of adventures, and like you said, most of your work has been in Canada, but you've also done quite a bit in Greenland and a little bit in Alaska. Do you know exactly how many different populations that you've studied?
I think it's probably about 9 or 10 populations. Yeah, out of the circumpolar populations. Yeah.
Wow, that's quite a broad range. Been kind of all over the place. So to start, just for our viewers to learn a little bit about polar bears, can you tell us a little bit about their life cycle, how they breed, how they feed, coming on and off the ice, all of that with the seasons, and a bit how they work?
Yeah, so most of the polar bear's life is spent out on the sea ice. That's where they hunt, how they travel. It's where they mate. And in some cases even den, so that the polar bears are intimately linked with the sea ice. Without sea ice, there really isn't much to say. It really wouldn't be much in the way of polar bears. They are the most carnivorous of the bear species. Their primary prey are seals, mostly ring seals, but they will take other seals, plus walruses, small whales like beluga. So basically they're carnivores, and they're adapted to living on the ice in the extreme colds. They have a very high-fat diet, and they're a superbly adapted four-legged mammal that lives in a marine environment.
Yeah, and four-legged and very, very large at that. To be able to live in such a harsh climate and be so big is definitely not an easy feat. So let's maybe take a closer look at the reproductive cycle of a polar bear. So how does that work? Because I know the female bears, they go through quite a long fasting period when they have bred successfully, and then to go into a den as well. So that's kind of
So pretty much across the polar bear's global, circumpolar range, they all have the same. All polar bears have the same basic reproductive cycle, which starts with mating, typically in April and May on the sea ice. Females that become pregnant don't immediately start undergoing gestation. The blastocyst, as it's called, which is the fertilized egg that's divided a few times, stays in a kind of a state of stasis. It's called delayed implantation. So after mating in April and May, those adult females that are pregnant will start to accumulate large amounts of fat, and they can actually double their body weight. Eventually in the summer, when the ice melts, they'll come onto shore, and they will begin to look for a place to go to den. and depending on where they are in the Arctic, that den may be dug into the earth. In other places, it will be up in the mountains, in the snowfields, or it will be in areas where they can dig shallow pits where snow will accumulate and from which they can create their own den. So basically, the females will go into a den, usually October, November. They'll stay in that den. While they go into that den, that little blastocyst will start to implant, and then at that point gestation begins. Gestation's quite short. Typically it will be only a couple of months. So when polar bear cubs are born usually in January, they're extremely small. They're hairless and very small, very much dependent upon their mother. At that time, they're still within the dens. The mother will provide milk. They'll grow rapidly, and then eventually, as they get large enough, the mother will break out of the den, usually in sort of March, sometimes April, and she'll lead her cubs out onto the sea ice. She will then keep those cubs for approximately up to 2 years, 2 to 3 years, depending on how well they do, and eventually she'll wean them. So it's a pretty long reproductive cycle. From mating to weaning, you're talking about 3 years. And during that time, the mothers undergo these enormous changes in body weight. They literally can lose half their body weight. So it's an incredible reproductive cycle.
Yeah, because from the time that they come off the sea ice and then go into a den and then finally emerge in early March, somewhere around there, they're not eating that entire time. So that's 9 months of fasting, and while completing a gestation is pretty
that's
incredible.
Right. That's one of the incredible things about these polar bears is that the adult females that are pregnant, if let's say they come onto land in July or August and they go into a den eventually over the winter, when they eventually then they emerge out of the dens in March. So they've gone from up to 7-8 months without eating, depending on where in the Arctic they are. So they've undergone not only a period completely without food, but they've also managed to produce cubs and produce milk to feed those cubs during that time. So unbelievable.
And that milk, from what I've heard, is incredibly high fat. It's like you often describe it as being like yogurt. Like the same sort of nutritional content as well as texture.
I mean, we always think about our milk as being 1%, 2% milk. Well, polar bear milk is usually in the early stages of lactation is 40-45% fat. So it's thick.
Because those cubs, they go from being something this size to when they come out of the den, they're about the size of a 3-month-old puppy or something, even maybe a little bit bigger than that, around there.
When they're born, they're
incredibly rapid.
That's right.
Growth.
When they're born, they're probably less than a kilogram or a kilogram. By the time they come out of the dens, they'll be 10, 12 kilos. So in the course of 2 to 2.5 months, they've literally increased their weight tenfold.
That's pretty incredible. So you mentioned about sort of some of the different denning scenarios of polar bears depending on where they live, and you've worked in one of those sort of unique locations being Churchill, Manitoba, which is one of the only places, or maybe it is the only place, where polar bears actually den in earth dens. So tell us a little bit about that.
So Churchill, the Western Hudson Bay population, which Churchill is in, is one of the most southerly polar bear populations, and the bears there, they are able to dig dens in the ground, in the earth. Usually they'll dig dens into a bank, a river bank, or a lake shore, and they're able to dig a den that's almost, as I said, it's almost entirely earthen, made from earth. There are the neighboring population called Southern Hudson Bay does something similar as well, but it's only these southerly populations that can do that. Higher up in the Arctic, there's too much permafrost, the ground's frozen, they simply can't dig dens in the earth, so they have to rely on snowfall. entirely, and that snow, sometimes there will be bears that will go up into the mountains to where the snow first falls, or where sometimes the snow stays all year round, and they'll be able to dig dens up in those mountains. In some places where there are no mountains, usually what they'll do is they'll scrape out a pit as deep as they can make it, and then it'll be usually on some sort of slope where the prevailing winds will dump snow on top of it, and that will eventually create enough snow for them to create chambers.
Chamber. Wow, that's pretty amazing. So those earthen dens, do you ever see, because they'll stay sort of in place, whereas a snow den will melt. Do you see reuse of those dens over,
absolutely,
over the course
some of the dens
years?
there have been some studies that have demonstrated that dens are used repeatedly, and over generations.
Yeah, wonderful. So let's hear a little bit about sort of back to the earlier years of your career. Your PhD you did on energetics of polar bears, and it was in the Western Hudson Bay population. So tell us a little bit about that, what the process of that was like.
Yeah, so my PhD was focused on looking at the energetics of polar bears, specifically what does it cost polar bears in order to go without food during the summer and the fall and over the denning period, and how does their body condition while they're fasting impact their reproductive performance, their ability to produce cubs. So that was it. Involved following a sample of individual bears over time to monitor changes in their size and condition, and also whether or not they were producing cubs.
Yeah, wow, pretty amazing stuff, and I guess a very useful tool for gauging how bears are going to tolerate a changing climate. Very useful information for that sort of thing.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, because now, as we know, climate change is affecting bears. It's impacting their ability to hunt when the ice melts early or forms late. It shortens their feeding windows, and has other potential effects on the productivity of the ecosystem that might actually affect the amount of food that they can gather. When we know how much it costs the polar bear to go without food, and how their reproductive performance is influenced by their body condition, it basically gives us the very beginnings of being able to understand how climate change would impact bears energetically and reproductively.
Yeah, pretty amazing. So do you have a general number of in a typical summer, say in Western Hudson Bay, what is the weight loss like for a bear? Like how much a body condition are they losing? Is there a poundage or a kilogram number that you have?
I think a good general sort of average would be about 1 kilogram a day.
Wow.
It depends on the size of the bear, and also the sex, and also their reproductive status. Some bears will use more energy and therefore lose more weight. Others will lose a little bit less weight. But on average, about 1 kilogram, a couple of pounds a day. Yeah.
Wow. So kind of bouncing off of that topic of energetics and weight loss, sort of on average, what are the nutritional requirements for a female who is trying to raise cubs? How often does she need to be hunting and things like that? And I guess supposedly it will change as the cubs grow, but typically.
So we don't have very precise estimates of how often a polar bear needs to catch a seal, but the evidence that we have suggests it may be somewhere probably one seal every 7 to 10 days, something in that range. It would be the sort of seems to be what they can achieve.
Yeah. So pretty frequently for sure. And then in 2021, just to look at some numbers of populations now, you completed an aerial survey of it had been going on for about 10 years, I believe, of Western Hudson Bay, the population. What were some of the key results from that survey, that the outcomes that you saw?
Right. Yeah, so we conducted aerial surveys in 2011, There was one in 2016, and then again in 2021. And when we compared, so first of all, when we compared the results of those surveys, it showed us that the population appeared to have declined from around 900 to 1,000 bears down to just over 600 bears in 2021. So that was the first finding. Perhaps more significantly, we found that amongst the population there had been a significant decline in the number of subadult bears. These are juvenile bears that have left their mother and they're not fully grown. We found a significant decline in subadult bears and in adult females. And what was important about that is that decades ago it was predicted that when climate change started to negatively affect polar bears, that those effects would be seen first amongst the subadult population, the juvenile population, and to some extent amongst adult females, in part because subadult bears are they're growing, so they have higher energy and nutritional requirements, but at the same time they're not very experienced in hunting seals. So hunting seals is a skill that they have to develop. So they're very challenged when they're subadults, and so they're much more vulnerable to essentially starvation.
Yeah, it's already they're already starting off. It's already hard to learn and be growing, and then you add the element of less sea ice, and it just
so that was what was interesting about the survey results, is that we are starting to see in Western Hudson Bay previously predicted signs of sort of population stress. So that was fascinating.
Concerning for the future of that population.
Very much
at this
so,
moment. It's I guess kind of the breakdown of that reproductive level. You don't have the replacement of the older bears that are aging out.
If your juvenile bears are not surviving, that means then you have fewer bears becoming adults, which means that over time your population is going to get older and older and older, and as those older bears die off, the population, its ability to produce new cubs, new offspring, is going to drop drastically.
So kind of bouncing off of that with a little bit looking at the effects of climate change. So it's commonly heard that the Arctic is warming about 4 times faster than other areas in the world. Having worked in these regions and these landscapes, what are some of those tangible and visible changes that have you seen in those regions?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about having worked on polar bears for three or more decades is that you get to go back to places that you've previously worked in. So it's one of the most noticeable things for me has been the quality of the sea ice has deteriorated so significantly in the last 3 decades. We used to be able to work quite safely on the sea ice, quite far offshore sometimes. Landing helicopters, it was relatively easy because we were confident that the ice was thick enough. But nowadays the ice is thinner. It's not as stable, so there's more movement in the ice, and in some places it's become really quite dangerous to work now. And it's so from personal experience, I've seen how the sea ice has deteriorated.
And as you said, interesting to be able to go away for a few years or more at a time, and then to come back and see those changes can I guess be quite drastic, and just makes the logistics of doing the research that much harder. So tell us a little bit about some of the process of collecting data. So I know there's a few different types of surveys and studies, like you do everything from population counts to mark recaptures, biopsy darting, and then capture work and all of that. Tell us a bit about how that process works, taking the measurements, all of that.
So there are different ways that we monitor polar bear populations. traditionally or typically we've done it through what we call mark recapture, where we will actually capture polar bears, and we will give them ear tags so they can be identified, and then we'll let them go, and then over the course of several years we may encounter those same bears again. This allows us to track their survival, their reproduction, and it also allows us to estimate the size of the population. So that's called a mark recapture. We also use other things. Instead of doing physical capture, we can do what's called a genetic mark recapture, where instead of actually capturing bears, we'll just take a small biopsy sample from them without actually having to handle them. We use a little dart that takes a piece of skin about the size of the head of a pencil, and from that we can identify sex of the bear, and give it an individual identity. And that also allows us to track bears through time. We can estimate population size, reproduction, and so on, survival. So those are two methods of monitoring the population size and trends. Then we have aerial surveys, where we will go out, and our goal is simply to get a snapshot of what is the population size at this particular point in time. And it gives us less information than mark recapture, but it also is a very quick way of checking in on a population to see, how's it doing right now. Whereas mark recapture studies take several years, usually 3-5 years or more to complete one. We can do an aerial survey in a single year. Besides all that, there are numerous other studies that are conducted on polar bears simultaneous to all these monitoring programs, especially when polar bears are being captured. What we will do is we will make the best possible use of the opportunity, and that involves taking measurements of body size, check length and skull sizes. We'll take samples of hair and claw, which can be used for monitoring things like heavy metal, like mercury levels. We'll take blood samples, milk samples. We will weigh them. We will take a small tooth, which is a tiny little tooth that they have that they don't need. It's called a vestigial premolar. It's just a leftover remnant of when they were previously herbivorous or omnivorous. We'll take that little tooth out, and we can section that, and we use that to age the bears. So really we take every possible sample we can, and those samples and the data are used for a range of studies, everything from genetics, contaminant studies, nutritional studies, looking at the sources of food bears are eating. We can look at health issues, exposure to certain viruses and bacteria, all kinds of stuff that we can do. So yeah, immense amount of information that we can get from just each handling. Yeah,
kind of building up a database, right, using just one bear, so that you can use all of that information in several different studies or papers.
Yeah, that's
Very
right.
efficient way of doing it, for sure. So just for a little bit of fun, tell us a little bit about some of the experiences of, living for sometimes extended periods of time or short periods of time in these remote areas and working in them, and some of the, the experiences doing that.
Some encounters.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I mean, there's so many stories. It's hard to sort of really pick them, but I think that some of the favorite ones are when I've been in field camps, remote camps, staying in cabins, and we've actually had polar bears that have walked right up to the cabin door and knocked on the door or banged on the windows. Those are always quite interesting times. I can remember one occasion when I was staying in a place called the Churchill Northern Study Center, and I was at a desk sitting in front of a window, and I was entering polar bear data from the previous day, and all of a sudden the room went dark, and I look up, and there's actually a polar bear stretched over the window with its head looking down at me and just staring at me. So yeah, there have been those, and then there have been a few, the usual sort of, we've had the scary encounters. Sometimes bears have managed to creep up on us while we're out on the ice, and so we're always very, very careful and constantly watching. But even despite that, we sometimes do get bears that get very close. Yeah.
So some pretty incredible and sometimes nerve-wracking experiences. So going back a little bit to some of the population trends and things like that, in terms of across the world in southerly and northerly populations, are we seeing a singular trend of decline, or what are we? Is it or is it varied? What is the sort of the trends that we're seeing at the moment?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things that I suppose that many members of the public have in their minds is that climate change polar bears means polar bear populations are declining, and that is true for some populations, especially the ones in the very southern extent of the polar bear range. There are negative things happening to those populations, but at the present time there are also populations that are doing different things. For example, in some parts of the high Arctic, we're actually seeing polar bear populations increasing in size, in number, and the main reason for that is that years ago those areas would have been covered with what's called multi-year ice, which is very, very thick ice that doesn't melt. It's more than a year old. It hasn't melted in the same year that it was formed, and that ice is not suitable for polar bears. It's too thick. They can't get through it, and it's also not good for seals. So in decades ago in the high Arctic, the polar bear populations were not as productive because of that poor ice. As climate change has progressed, there's been less and less multi-year ice in the high Arctic, and more what we call annual ice, which is thinner ice, and it forms and melts in the same year. And what that's allowed is it's allowed it's created better habitat for polar bears. It's created better habitat for seals. Generally, the marine environment has sort of undergone an increased productivity right from the very bottom, with phytoplankton to zooplankton, fish, seals, all the way up to polar bears. So you've seen a bit of a boom in the population in some places in the high Arctic, and that doesn't come as a big surprise. It was predicted that there was, in the early stages of how climate change was affecting polar bears, that there would be this slight positive benefit. But what was also predicted was that as the loss of ice continues, and that you go from multi-year ice to annual ice and then to less annual ice, eventually there would be negative effects. So if you look across polar bears global range, you'll see the more southerly populations are the ones that are experiencing the negative effects. There are others that are experiencing in the high Arctic that are experiencing currently positive effects, and then there are others that are sort of in between, and a lot depends on the circumpolar Arctic is not a it's not a homogeneous area of habitat and productivity. There are certain areas of the Arctic that are more productive, more suitable for bears, others that are not good habitat. The marine environment's not productive. So we're seeing quite a varied response to climate change, dependent upon where each population is. But I mean, the big theme is that eventually, any population that's experiencing a loss of sea ice, which is all of them, will eventually show negative response. There'll be detrimental effects to the population.
So it's like you said, there's still loss of ice that's going on in the high Arctic, but it's also that loss of ice is changing the type of ice, and that's right. You're seeing this boom, but it's going to turn into a bust. Eventually.
It is predicted that it will turn into a bust.
So kind of jumping off of that, what are it's a little bit sort of the same question, but some of the struggles you see polar bears facing in the near future, and is there, do polar bear biologists see a way that bears could adapt to a climate with less sea ice? A little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, the future at the present time, it's is pretty bleak. With continued climate change, ice loss. I mean, the future is somewhat certain. We know that there will just be simply less and less bears over time. Whether or not they can adapt to less ice, I mean, everything we know so far about polar bears is that they're well adapted to hunting seals in a marine environment, but they are not well adapted to making a living by searching for food on land. So at this point in time, the evidence suggests that if the sea ice disappears, so will the polar bears.
Yeah, and I guess part of that is because they've evolved to thrive on these diets of high fat content from things like blubber, from marine mammals and things. They don't do particularly well on a high protein diet, or things like you would see in terrestrial mammals, like and birds, such things like that.
Well, we've done studies where we've looked at polar bears that have been living on land during the summertime, where they have actually gone out and found food. They've been feeding on berries, on caribou carcasses, looking in some cases getting access to geese, nesting geese, and things like that. But from those studies, we've found that the energy that they use to go and search for that food is basically equal to the energy they get from eating that food. So there's no net benefit that we've seen. Polar bears, they're a big animal. They're the biggest of the 3 bear species in North America. To maintain that type of body size and to be able to go into a den and overwinter, they need these high energy, high fat diets.
Yeah. So jumping off of that, if we were to see the effects of climate change, in a perfect world, see them halted, is there still a way for these populations to rebound and regenerate at this point?
Well, I think like most species, that are affected by changing climate, I think if those changes were stopped or even reversed, there's a certain amount of resilience in the population that polar bears certainly would be able to live on, persist to some extent. Absolutely. There is still opportunity to have polar bears in the world.
Yeah. So we haven't run out of time yet. We've still got time to fix it. So that's always something to keep in mind. It's definitely not all doom and gloom. There is still a light there.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wonderful. So on that note, for people wanting to get involved in the conservation of polar bears, what's a good way for them to do that? Would you say?
Well, I think obviously there's lots of written material out there that's available to be read, but I would encourage people to go and see for themselves. I mean, we always think of polar bears as being this distant animal way up in the Arctic, and it's difficult to go and see and get to. But in fact, there are places where you can get to quite easily and see polar bears. So, for example, going up to Churchill in Manitoba, by train or by plane, you have a wonderful opportunity to see polar bears, whether it's in the summertime or in the fall. Some great opportunities, and I would just encourage people to go, see them for themselves, and also to, there are organizations that are dedicated to polar bear conservation. Polar Bears International, for example, World Wildlife Fund, have all sorts of volunteer opportunities. So I just sort of say, go see and educate yourselves a little bit more. And polar bears are one species amongst thousands that are affected by climate change, but they tend to be the focus of people's attention because they're a large,
they're a charismatic
animal,
megafauna, so.
But they also, they are also a bellwether, if you like, an indicator of the health of the Arctic, and I think that they're an easy focus for people's concerns, which is perfectly fine.
Yeah, it's great because there's the saying of you protect one species and you protect the entire ecosystem that it lives in. So, and we know that the Arctic is one of the most diverse and rich ecosystems in the world. So that's a great way of doing that. And yeah, going up there, going to a place like Churchill, going out on the tours, it's all supporting, most of the tour companies, they support the research efforts, and they give money and things like that. So that's definitely a great way of getting involved. And and I think just being an advocate and a voice is so important as well.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Wonderful. Okay. Wonderful. So thanks for coming on my channel today. It was nice to have a chat about polar bears and be able to put it out to the world, because this is, honestly, I would say this is basically the conversation that we just have every week anyways.
Yeah, exactly.
Behind the scenes. So great to put it out there, and I think it's really important that people get to know this stuff and get a little bit more educated, because I think it helps to feel a little bit more connected to these species. So thank you for coming on. I hope you guys have all enjoyed this today. I will link all of the research and the papers that we referred to today. I'll link them down below in the description. But other than that, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope you'll come back for the next one.
Yeah.
And
thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Nice to sort of meet you.
Yeah. Okay. Bye, guys.
Bye.